Thank you very much. And I know you had to rush back, so I admire the multitasking. Mr. Donfried, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for having me this evening. And it's the first time for me here, and I hear that there's been some cooperation in the past. El-Arabi actually left Berlin since 2007. So this is already...
He was foreign minister also briefly.
He was foreign minister briefly, so... but very much interested to discuss how we can push that forward, and very happy to see all of you at the embassy. It would be my pleasure. We reflect today on the fall of the Berlin Wall. And I find myself thinking about other walls that we need to take down in today's world. The wall that was here in Germany was a symbol of conflict, antagonism, polarity, and deprivation. Now that this wall is gone, we are still grappling with the notions of how to overcome the same walls all over the world. The war in Ukraine has exploded last February, and the world has changed with it. The situation quickly gained urgency and demanded immediate action. The world was strained economically, socially, and politically. The war had and continues to have destructive effects on Ukraine and Russia. It shattered the hitherto assumed normal of post-World War Europe. And coming at the back end of a pandemic that crippled economic and social life, the war in Ukraine has had ripple effects on all four corners of the earth, including the already fragile countries of the Middle East. We all have condemned the war, and we have all been impacted by it. Yet the impacts of the war have affected us differently, and this is what requires attention. The war in Ukraine has trapped many countries of the world. On the one hand, there have been severe price increases of food and energy due to the war, and given the importance of both Russia and Ukraine as producers in those markets. On the other hand, the crisis hit the world at an extremely vulnerable moment, when the world was facing the cascading crises of the COVID-19 pandemic, and now the unmistakable signs of climate change. Today, our multilateralism is being tested. In the midst of calls for solidarity and joint action to confront global challenges, the reservations and fears of the rest of the world still have not garnered enough concern. The war in Ukraine is a chance to either confirm adherence to international norms and human solidarity, or succumb to self-centrism and double standards. The Middle East is one of the hardest hit regions of the world by the war in Ukraine. Much of the world felt the impact of the grain shipment disruptions, but the situation in the Middle East is much worse. Around a third of the world's wheat comes from Russia and Ukraine. Some Middle East countries rely on those two countries alone for more than half of their imports. Middle East countries depend heavily on food imports, particularly wheat. One prime example is Egypt, the world's largest importer of wheat, where almost 80% of that wheat comes from Russia and Ukraine. And while food prices increased in the world by varying percentages, the price of wheat has doubled in Egypt. While no sanctions have been imposed on Russian imports of grain, importers are finding it extremely difficult to purchase grain from Russia because of difficulties in transferring funds to Russian companies and ensuring the transport ships. And the loss of fertilizer supplies from Russia and Belarus have led to fertilizer prices rising even faster than that of food prices. Many farmers in the Middle East, and especially the smallholders, were thus squeezed to reduce production as the fertilizers they needed became more expensive than the grains they are supposed to sell. The repercussions for conflict-ridden countries like Syria or Yemen are dire indeed. Food supplies, along with humanitarian and emergency assistance, have been significantly constrained, and the UN has already warned of an impending famine in Yemen. And the crisis is not limited to food prices and shortages. A new problem began to unfold in the energy sector as the world began to recover from COVID-19 and demand started to rise. The war in Ukraine came to shock the energy markets by increasing the energy prices. Understandably, the effect of high energy prices has been uneven in the Middle East, and despite of the general relief that some Middle East countries benefited from oil prices, analysis shows that the average inflation is spiking in the entire region. According to a UN study, the Middle East is severely exposed to a number of disruptions, such as increased public debt reaching sometimes up as high as 75% in some countries. The increase in energy prices and the increase in the levels of malnourishment because of the high food prices. Extreme poverty in the region is expected to increase by 2.8 million people by the end of this year. So clearly, rising food prices, rising energy prices, and the tightening of financial conditions can have important effect each on its own, but they can also feed into each other, creating tensions within and between states. Governments which are unable to manage these vulnerabilities find themselves under growing pressures to meet the needs of their populations. In some instances, these pressures can lead to popular explosions, particularly in states already experiencing political fragility. It is important to realize that the war in Ukraine has also had an indirect destabilizing influence on several already fragile theaters in the Middle East. In Syria, for example, analysts expect that the Russian military presence there shall alter in strength and character, particularly with the series of setbacks for the Russian troops, as we witnessed lately in Ukraine. The situation in Syria is far from stable or quiet. Syrian territory today is the theater of military operations and attacks by Israel as well as Turkey. Iran's military presence is also an undeniable reality. The Russian military presence in Syria has served as a guarantor of the survival of the Assad regime. And while many would disagree with that regime, there is no doubt that its fall would destabilize the whole Arab Mashriq. In Libya and its southern flank in the Sahel region, Russian presence and influence has been a reality for several years. While the international community has been engaged to secure a peace and reconstruction process in Libya, that goal has been elusive so far. The lack of a strong, unified central government in Libya has meant that this strategically important country spilled instability to its entire neighborhood, including Egypt and the Sahel countries. While Egypt has been able to regain control of its 1,200-kilometer border with Libya, the series of coups d'etats in Mali, Burkina Faso, and Chad are a case in point. The continued war in Ukraine provides an obvious platform for this fragile region to be further manipulated as part of the confrontation in Ukraine. Ladies and gentlemen, I started by remembering a bygone war and the urgency to face newly erected ones. Perhaps it's no secret that mitigating the socio-economic impacts of the war in Ukraine can only be done through stabilizing the markets, increasing investments, supporting food and energy security, not just in developed countries, but also in the rest of the world, for all people and all countries. But the question here is whether we have done enough. I do not think that we have done everything in our power to protect the lives and livelihoods of millions of people around the world. What we have learned, and we keep learning time and again, from the pandemic, the waves of migration in the Mediterranean, and now from the impacts of the war, is that isolationism is not possible. Our world has become so intertwined that this option is no longer viable. The protection of our shared planet is another case in point where isolationism is impossible. The United Nations Conference on Climate Change, taking place in Egypt as of yesterday, aims to address the impacts of climate change. The Global South is disproportionately experiencing the impact of rising temperatures, the environmental degradation, natural disasters, weather extremities, food and water scarcity. The Middle East is warming at twice the global average of the rest of the world. Ecosystems, inhabitants, and livelihoods in Egypt, Algeria, Lebanon, Morocco, Tunisia, and the United Arab Emirates are all suffering from the impact of rapid climate change. COP27 puts in perspective the need for a real and serious solution. The industrialized countries are responsible for more than 22% of global CO2 emissions. In contrast, Africa's contribution is a mere 3%. African countries need some $1.3 trillion to finance their climate needs. At a time when the world is stretched by the cascade of threats, including the war in Ukraine, it is very doubtful that this financing will be forthcoming. Ladies and gentlemen, erasing the wall was only possible by standing for the values of justice and equality and the commitment to work in order to ensure the global norms remain credible. As Egypt's President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi declared yesterday in the opening of the COP27, every effort should be made to stop the war in Ukraine. The cost for Ukraine, for Russia, for Europe, and indeed the whole world is far too high. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency. We'd be most grateful if we could ask also some questions and make some comments as well. The floor is yours. So who would like to go first? If someone has a question for the Ambassador of Egypt, please. And if you could go to the microphone, it would be excellent. And briefly introduce yourself.
Your Excellency, thank you for your presentation, and I'm glad that Egypt is represented here. And I would like to. I'm Jack from Zambia. Yes, I'm a student doing international relations and cultural diplomacy. I'd like to find out at what level is Egypt involved in the issues around, like, take example of Ukraine and Russia wars, and as also the Syrian issues. How is Egypt fully involved? And the other issue is, don't you think cultural diplomacy has failed all these issues? Because I believe key players in cultural diplomacy should have taken this at the earlier stage. Maybe if we could have employed protective diplomacy, and like a situation where we see escalation of conflict, and then that's when we begin to talk about cultural diplomacy. For me, I feel this is a failure on this part. And it's like we've left everything to be played by the superpowers, the big nations. And mostly we are seeing it on a business aspect. Yeah, we are seeing it. It's like there's money involved. We allow the situations to escalate. We do business as usual. And then we bring in these aspects later on, begin to talk about no cultural diplomacy, let's bring people together. But how do we bring Russia and Ukraine when we are playing blame games? I don't think this will work, looking at how Russia has been labeled. So I feel we needed to put cultural diplomacy in the first place before we talk about any other things. Thank you so much.
Shall we take a couple and we?
If you'd like.
Yeah.
Would someone else like to ask an additional question or comments? And then the ambassador can respond to too. Please. Okay. If you could go to the microphone, please.
Thank you, Ambassador, for your speech. It was very insightful. My question does not necessarily relate to the topic, but since you are here, Your Excellency, I would like to ask the question about the dispute, water dispute between Ethiopia, about the water dispute about the Nile River, which flows through Sudan, Ethiopia, and Egypt. And I would like to ask how you think this dispute can be solved, because Ethiopia is building a dam in the river, and Egypt has been resenting against it. So how you think this can be solved? Thank you.
Okay.
Is there a third comment or question?
Okay.
Okay.
Hello, thank you very much for your presentation. My name is Anna, and I'm from Russia. So my question is, what are the challenges of Egypt keeping the neutral position in this conflict, and if there's any pressure put on Egypt from different sides to actually choose the side? And I have one more question, like how do you rank the freedom of speech and freedom of media in Egypt? Thank you very much.
That should be more than a plates full. In a very simple question to answer to my brother from Zambia, war is not diplomacy by other means. War is a failure of diplomacy. No doubt about it. If diplomacy fails, then war becomes the only option. And history has taught us that war was never the solution, that you always come back to the diplomacy. And so I think in retrospect, when we study this war with Ukraine, I think we will find very serious failings on the part of diplomats. The signs were very clear. The requests of both sides were very clear, but there was never success in finding the middle ground. And thus, we have the war that we have now, which is, as I try to convey to you, is costing the whole world very, very dearly. And so there is not one shred of doubt that this is the situation. As for the money factor and the business factor of it, if I understood your question correctly, you were referring that there were winners and losers. This is what you were telling us, or did I misunderstand you?
I think I said my picture was when war breaks out, I think mostly people are concerned with business. There's always business involved, and therefore they wouldn't want to address peace and they always want to see war progress so they can make money.
But you see, what I have tried to explain to you, that there are really no winners in this war, in this particular war, because of the timing, because of the nature of the two warring parties. Because of the fact that it comes after the COVID pandemic, that we're all losing. Look at the inflation that is happening here in Germany. Look at the price rises in energy, in foodstuffs. And I'm talking about Germany, one of the biggest economies in the world. So how is it in Egypt? How is it in Zambia? Tremendous pressures. And so It is. I think this particular war, the consequences are beyond us, and I don't think that any one group has any control. I think it has gone out of control, and this is part of the problem that we are having now. The question, Anna, the question on the challenges of keeping neutral, you assume that we are neutral. This is the assumption. And as if you followed the voting in the General Assembly, Egypt has voted twice. Once to condemn the Russian invasion, and the second time to not to recognize the annexation of the 4 states. And so there is very clear indication. And actually it's not Egypt alone, but 140 countries have voted positively for these 2 resolutions. But you are right. Even that vote was a very challenging vote to make, even this call. And this is part of the problem that most of the developing countries are facing, especially in Africa, that they feel that they are getting the consequences, all the negative consequences of this war, while they have had absolutely nothing to do with why it started, how it is developed, and the reactions that are leading to all these cascading effects that are impoverishing people, that are making energy and food crises, that are depriving countries of the possible financing for their economic development, or to the combating of climate change. And so the question, the natural question that many of the people are asking is, it is not of our concern. As a matter of fact, people are taking the position in many of the developing countries and saying, but we have been living all these conditions of war and violations of international law and all this injustice is not new to us. Look at the colonial past in Africa. Look at the situation in the occupied territories in Palestine. So what's new? This is the reality of the world as many of the developing countries see it and have recognized it. Nevertheless, because of that, most developing countries had to make the principled position that we cannot afford a breakdown in international norms and international law. But that doesn't resolve the issue. We have a war going on, a war that is costing both Ukraine and Russia, not just economically, but in terms of the human cost, in terms of the breakdown of the post-World War II system in Europe. And this will have very far-reaching consequences, because it's once this system is broken, the question that we have not yet started contemplating the answer to is, so what is going to be the shape of the international system once the war stops? What is going to be the role of Russia? What is going to be the role of China? What is going to be the role of Europe? We've seen here in Germany, and I hope you're following this, but Germany is now rethinking this Zeitenwende and the change in the German foreign policy, readily from at one point in time refusing to export weapons to very willingly and with a huge acceptance, popular acceptance, exporting heavy machinery in war zones. If remember, when the war started in February, Germany offered 5,000 helmets. Remember that. Mm-hmm. And so from helmets to heavy weaponry systems in the space of 6 months is quite 8 months, quite a change. But what is the international system going to look like afterwards? How is the world going to look like? What will be the dynamics? I think this is the question that perhaps that would be the subject matter of another brainstorming session. So, indeed, very challenging. And in the case of Egypt, for example, Egypt has had very good relations with Russia, historical relations with the Soviet Union and then Russia. Just last week, the first of 4 nuclear power plants have started construction. A $10 billion project. And most of the countries in the region and around the world have very deep and important relations with Russia. Russia is a superpower, and obviously, with very long reaches around the world. Perhaps the one positive factor, and I say this is a footnote for my African brothers who are in this room, that for the first time, and because of the patterns of voting in the General Assembly, many in Western Europe now are questioning whether they have done enough to ensure that the African positions are sympathetic to how the Western positions are. So for the first time now we find that there is a renewed and added concentration on, so what are the positions of African countries? Why are they behaving like this? Why is it that they're taking these positions? And there's a process of review of policies towards many of the developing countries because of the positions vis-a-vis the war in Russia. How do I rank freedom and of speech and media? I'm sure that you can Google that and it will come out to you. But I honestly don't understand what is it that you're asking exactly.
So is there like a freedom of speech in Egypt in terms of everybody allowed to say what they want to say, like the journalists are not getting attacked due to their opinions, or I guess us coming from Russia, it's like seeing what's happening there, so you cannot easily tell your opinions, so you can get into prison. That's why I was asking, how is it in terms of freedom of speech in Egypt?
I can only refer you to the tens of daily newspapers that are published, and the 54,000 NGOs that are operating, and I can only refer you to those. So I really don't know how else to respond. The water dispute. Very important question, and you ask the pertinent question: can it be solved? We certainly hope so, because if it is not solved, and this is what Egypt has said for the last 10 years, that this is an international security issue, and that since the Nile is the source of 90% of Egypt's water, upon which 100 million people rely, we cannot simply stand by and watch that water being denied to us. And so what we have done from day one is we have engaged in a negotiation process with Ethiopia and Sudan. And what we had requested is one request. We requested a legally binding agreement on the filling and operation of the dam that Ethiopia is building. Just this one request, a legally binding agreement. We actually went to the Security Council twice, requesting the Security Council to intervene and to ensure that Ethiopia is responsive to that request. Unfortunately, Ethiopia has not been forthcoming in the negotiations, and the negotiations have all but practically broken down. And there is no ongoing discussion of the facts now. And as a matter of fact, Ethiopia has already started the filling of the dam without the consent of either Egypt or the Sudan, which is potentially problematic because what the Ethiopians have decided to do is they've decided to build an extremely big dam. It will be the biggest dam in Africa. And the problem with that is, in order to fill the reservoir of the dam, you actually have to block the water. And so if the water yield, annual water yield, is not enough, this will mean that there isn't enough water to go to Sudan and Egypt. And this is where the problem will start. So far, we have been lucky that the last 3 years, the yield of the river has been above average. But we cannot rely on that as a process. What we need is a predictable, agreed, legally binding agreement. What do you do if the yield of the river is not as generous? So what do we do? How do we operate this? Do we ensure that the water still flows in order to ensure that there is agriculture and people drinking and livelihood in Sudan and Egypt? Or do we keep the water in the reservoir to generate electricity? And this is the point. The GERD, the dam, Renaissance Dam in Ethiopia, is an electricity dam. So you can create electricity, and you can have electricity through a multitude of ways. But if you compare, and Ethiopia has every right to build it. Ethiopia has every right to do whatever it needs for its own development. Nobody is in dispute with that principle. But the point is, if you're equating electricity production with drinking water, I think the choice is very clear where the priority should be. So we are still hopeful that we will be able to find a solution, negotiated, agreed, peaceful solution. The problem will arise when the situation will come to a point where it is no longer clear that there is any goodwill to reach that solution. And you would expect that Egypt would have to defend the right of its people to livelihood, which is the water. So we're not there yet. We are hoping that we never have to reach that point, and that we can find definitely a negotiated solution. That would be the best case scenario.
I'd like to ask you a question myself, if I may, about cultural diplomacy. I will go to the microphones. Your Excellency, I just wanted to ask you a question related more to cultural diplomacy. Traditionally, cultural diplomacy, I refer to as cultural diplomacy is about speaking. In the sense that I'm French, I want to show you French movies. I want to tell you about French culture. I want to show you French music. I have a lecture with the students where I talk about a possible thesis for future cultural diplomacy based more on listening than on speaking. And I always refer to the foreign minister of Mozambique, who said a great analogy: God gave us 2 ears and 1 mouth for a reason. We have to do as diplomats twice as much listening than speaking. And one of the examples I give in this lecture is actually Egypt. And I say, why was the world so surprised by the Arab Spring? You know, we've got these great intelligence agencies, all of these media opportunities. Why was it such a surprise? And my point there is if we had a different kind of cultural diplomacy, focused more about listening than speaking, we could have heard the echoes on the street, so to speak. If we were looking at Egyptian movies, if we were listening to Egyptian music, if we were working with Egyptian artists, civil society, the 54,000 NGOs you were mentioning. So my question is, first of all, what are your thoughts in general about this idea, cultural diplomacy focused more about listening or really getting to know the other? And secondly, what would be maybe a success story of Egyptian cultural diplomacy that you've experienced or observed?
I totally agree about the 2 years in one mouth. This was one of the very first things my mother taught me, by the way, that you should listen twice as much as you speak. The principle of exchange is what's at the heart of what you call cultural diplomacy. And so you will find out that this exchange is very skewed. So in some areas you will find that people are actually listening to each other because they regard themselves as equal. The problem arises when somebody decides that he or she is of different level. And so when that happens between cultures, you find this cultural gap. And this is when people tend to lecture rather than speak or listen. And this is perhaps explains a little bit what was happening in the Arab Spring, not just in Egypt, but all around. Although I must warn a little bit that and this could also be another topic of discussion, although there were deep misgrievances in the Arab world, I do not believe that the Arab Spring would have turned as it did without foreign intervention. And you can easily prove this, when you look at the young men and women who were demonstrating in downtown Cairo on the 25th of January. There wasn't any calls for the departure of the president. There were very specific demands for bread, freedom, and social justice. So these were the demands of the young, a new social contract, if you want, with the government, with the existing government. There wasn't to start with any intention to overthrow that government, and I think it's the same in Libya. It's the same in Tunisia. There were deep grievances, but how far people were willing to go is perhaps a topic of discussion. And so you do have to have that. You need to have that exchange. And I'm very happy to see that there are some Egyptians here with us in this room. This is part of the exchange. Egypt today has 2 universities, 2 fully accredited German universities, 7 fully accredited German schools. There are some 500,000 Egyptians who speak German as their first foreign language. And so that is the requisite infrastructure for that exchange, if you want. And your academy is part of that exchange, where people, you have so many different nationalities in this room. That is part of the exchange. So I think that should be encouraged and kept up.
Thank you very much. Okay. And what I'd like to do now, actually, is we have arranged a special reception in honor of the ambassador and also all of you that'll be ready at 5:30. That's with actually falafel and Northern African food, etc. So I'm hoping you might be able to stay at least for a few minutes for that. And if we could, if I could be so bold, I'd love to invite you to have an interactive discussion with our students and us. We prepared a little area outside where we can actually sit together with some of the students. And if it's okay with you, this is a chance for us to also allow the students to be interactive, to ask you questions about cultural diplomacy, policy, etc. 10 10, 15 minutes, and it would just give us a change of format, and then that'll also give the caterers time at 5:30 for the reception, and if we can maybe have a toast to you at the reception would be ideal. But would that be okay maybe for another 10 or 15 minutes? Or?
That's fine. No,
Okay?
yeah.
All right,
If okay.
All right, first of all,